Hey everyone, I'm Almar of almarsguides.com, and in this video here, I'm going to be talking about the Druid class in Everquest from Classic EQ all the way until the end of Prophecy of Ro. So I consider Prophecy of Ro to be the end of the Classic era of EQ. Classes and the game as a whole start to change so dramatically beyond that expansion that I just feel like classes beyond then really need a whole new class guide to kind of cover what's going on. And also Prophecy of Ro is when they stopped the 2 expansions a year and switched to the yearly expansions after that. And that's usually, like, EQ started to change quite a bit after that. So focusing on the Druid, I have a lot of experience on this class during this era. It is what I first played in Everquest. I started in Kunark. Well, actually, I started in Velius because the first game I bought was the Everquest Trilogy. And, I got into like level 30 or so before Planes of Power, and then like maybe level 50 in Planes of Power. Never got to max level, quit a bunch of times, kept coming back with like each expansion, leveling up a little bit more. And I basically played Druids until about right around Prophecy of Ro, actually. And then I main changed to Beast Lord and Shadow Knight. So basically all Druid guides are going to tell you that they are a jack of all trades, master of none. They can heal, damage, dot, provide a ton of utility, Spirit of the Wolf, levitation, roots, snares. They can also charm animals. They can do a whole bunch, but they're not amazing at any of those things. And this we're going to talk about a little bit later in the guide, because a lot of people will bust Druid's balls and consider them a useless class or a subpar class. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, because they are kind of right. There's a lot of value for Druids soloing and in group content, but the harder content you do, going up to raids and just very hard 6-box content, you are outclassed by a lot of other classes, and we're going to talk about that later. But that's something you should know about Druids and something you should be aware of, if for nothing else. So let's jump into what stats and focuses are important on the Druid. So the best stats that you're going to want to get are Wisdom and Stamina. Those are usually the two that I focus on the most in the early eras. You'll be able to start maxing out your stats around Luckland. That's when the buffs you get and the raid gear you get is basically just going to provide all of the stats that you need. So Druids are Wisdom casters, which is why you're focusing on Wisdom. As far as secondary stats go, I would recommend Strength and Agility, because Strength will allow you to carry more loot and carry more stuff in general, which is always great. And Agility is going to give you a little bit more AC and mitigation. Aside from those main stats, of course, you'll also want to focus on gear that gives AC, HP, mana, and mana regen, with mana and mana regen being the two main ways for you to improve your Druid beyond reaching Wisdom cap. So once you reach Wisdom cap, the only way for you to get mana would be getting mana directly on your gear. And the only way for you to really improve your Druid in a raid context, aka an end game context, would be by getting more mana. Because survivability stats aren't going to really help you on a raid. If something starts beating on you on a raid, you're probably just going to go down fast regardless of what your HP and AC and HP is. You are a leather class, so you're going to drop pretty fast. And you don't have Feign Death, which is unfortunate for you. So the more you focus on mana, the more of a glass cannon you're going to be. Another thing to mention is that for shields in Everquest, they will give you the full amount of AC towards your armor class. They won't, like, none of the AC on the shield will go to the soft cap. That's something to keep in mind. So a shield with very good armor class will give you a lot more survivability. So you can see here on my site, I list the main stats, what they're good for. I basically just explain this in an audio version. So as far as those stats, you're going to move into heroic stats in Planes of Power, Omens of War, Depths of Dark Hollow, etc. Each one of those expansions is going to start releasing more and more heroic stats until eventually you get to Secrets of Fader, and 75, 80, 85, where all of your benefit is going to be coming from heroic stats and all of your normal stats are going to be maxed. So heroic stats, they work kind of the same way as normal stats, although they do have a bit of variety and variation. I do have a heroic stats guide on my site, which you will be seeing on screen now. This will explain a lot about heroic stats and let you know what each one does, why you would want it, etc., etc. And I also have links to other guides explaining heroic stats as well. There's a lot for you to take in here, and I'm not going to dive into a lot of that now because that's kind of like the next era class guide. But keep in mind that if you play past Planes of Power, heroic stats are going to be added into the game, and they're going to start becoming more and more and more common the further you go in the game. For druids, you want to get heroic wisdom, heroic stamina, and heroic agility the most, with wisdom and stamina being the two most important in this era. More or less, you won't have to worry too much about heroic agility at all because the amount of heroic wisdom and stamina you get in this era will very unlikely go over the soft cap for them. So just worry about that now. If you're still playing, past Prophecy of Ro, dive into heroic stats, learn them, understand them. They're pretty good and useful. So important focus effects. Focus effects are added in Luckland, although you will see them on gear throughout Classic, Kunark, and Velius. They're always going to be listed on the stats or on the gear, despite not being active until Luckland. So there's quite a few different focus effects, and I'm going to list the best ones. They're on the screen right now too. So reagent conservation. This one is kind of useless for a druid. There's only some spells you have that require reagents, like enduring breath and levitation. Extended enhancement. This increases the duration of your buffs. This is nice, but not great. There's a lot of druid buffs that are going to be replaced in raids. The main buffs you'll be using are your damage shield, your resists, and your regeneration. Those are the three main buffs on raids that will not be replaced by other classes, although you could say your regeneration will be replaced by shamans because they get the same regen as you, and mages get a similar damage shield as you. So that gives you really one buff that you'll be casting often, which is resists. That some other people get resists, but you get pretty good like fire and cold resists, for example. Your protection of seasons is pretty solid, and people will need it for Nagi, Vox, and anything that does fire and cold damage. But aside from that, usually shamans will do the regen because they'll come with the most extended enhancement since they have so many other buffs that's quite important for them. So moving on to extended range, this increases the range of your spells. This one is actually a little bit more important for you because there's many scenarios where you'll want it. For example, if mobs start to run from your group, the extended range will mean they can get further away and you can still snare them. Extended range is also useful for healing and other situations. You can stand far away from the tank if needed, if the boss does something like fear or AoE or something like that. Then extended range will give you the range you need to stay away from the boss. Spell haste, this one is basically a must-have. Increases the cast or decreases the cast time of your spells. Basically gives you haste for spells. Improved damage, that increases the damage your direct damage spells do. This one is important for you if you plan to do a lot of nukes and a lot of direct damage spells, especially if you're going to be soloing. And that goes hand in hand with Burning Affliction, which is also going to be a very good foci if you're going to be soloing a lot. That one increases the damage of your damage over time spells. So figure out which of the two you use more, and then you'll want to get that focus, or you can get both. It's up to you. Mana preservation, this is an extremely important one because it's going to decrease the mana cost of all of your spells. That's healing, damage over time, direct damage, buffs, all of them. And improved healing. This is going to decrease the amount of, this is going to increase the amount that your heals heal for. This is important for you because you don't get complete heal and you don't get very big heals, so a 30% bonus to your healing spells or whatever your improved healing rank is going to help you out quite a bit. So with the important foci out of the way, let's move into important spells, skills, and AAs. So druids are going to be using all types of magic, although I'd recommend you specialize in alteration since this is going to be your primary buffing spell line, and it's also going to be what you heal with. And you're going to be doing mostly buffing and healing in raid environments, which is where specializations would be most important anyway. Your main buff, arguably, is going to be Spirit of the Wolf. That's in the early era, before Planes of Power, people are going to be bugging you all the time for transportation. They're going to want Spirit of the Wolf, and they're going to want ports, and they're going to rely on you for that all the way up until Planes of Power is added. And that's a blessing and a curse, depending on how you look at it. You might want to sell ports, and you might not mind porting people around, and that being your main use, but it's also a bit time-consuming and a bit annoying, depending on how you look at it, like I said. So, typically every expansion that adds new zones will add new port spells for you. You're also going to get an upgrade to Spirit of the Wolf called Spirit of Eagle. That happens in Lucklin, and you get a group version of that in Planes of Power called Flight of the Eagles. Both of them will last for over an hour. In the future, they'll last for over 2 hours. So, as I brought up earlier, I think you're also going to get an HP Type 1 buff. This will not stack with the Cleric's HP Type 1, although something to mention, keep in mind is that your HP Type 1 will give mana regen, which the Cleric's does not. That doesn't really matter in this era. People won't want your buff for the mana regen over the Cleric buff, most of the time, I should say. But it is useful to keep that in mind. So, your main 3 spells that you'll be using on raids, most likely, is your Damage Shield, Regen, and Resists. That's what people are going to be requesting from you the most. As I said, you'll get a powerful version of these in Lucklin, Planes of Power, and basically, as time goes on, with each new expansion that's added, you'll typically get upgrades for each of these buffs. With Resists being the oddball out, only occasionally will you get a new Resist spell upgrade. So, I'm going to go over a few Druid spell lines here, because there's a few Druid lines of spells which stack with everything else and are important for me to point out individually. So, you're going to get a self-damage shield buff. What this basically means is it's a self-damage shield that stacks with all of your other damage shields. And self-only, obviously. It's going to give you a very small amount of armor class and a very small amount of a damage shield, but it stacks with everything else, so it's worth using. You're also going to get a mask line of self-buffs. This is going to give you mana regen. It's going to give you, I think, ultra vision, and it's also going to change your camera a bit of where it moves your camera above your character and gives you more of a wide view, which allows you to see around you easier. In Canarch, you're going to get Mask of the Hunter. You're going to get Mask of the Stalker in Lucklin. You're going to get Mask of the Forest in POP, and you're going to get Mask of the Wild and Omens of War. Sorry, a little bit of a hiccup. You're also going to get mana regen with the mask buff, which is the main reason that people use it. Damage shields, I just talked about that. You're also going to, you get the best damage shield in the game, with mages being the only rival to the damage shield crown. So, utility spells. I'm just going to read the list that I have on my site, which is you get Invis, Levitation, Snare, Root, Succor, Teleportation spells, Resist spells, Spirit of the Wolf, Pacify, Regeneration, Strength, Resurrection, Nukes, Dots, Hots, Direct Heals, and more. You basically get a whole plethora of utility spells, and Druids are useful in many different scenarios for that reason. So one spell in there that you might have noticed is Resurrection. Druids don't get a res until Omens of War, which is the same time that Shamans get their res. It's a 90% res, it cannot be used in combat, and it has a long cooldown. Well, a long cooldown after you cast it. So if you're resing an entire group, it's going to take a while, in other words. And it's a res, more or less. Until it's the best res you're going to get until after Seeds of Destruction, which is when basically everybody gets every healer gets a 96% res. So you take what you can get for the time being. The next line I'll point out is Oaken Guard. This is added in Omens of War, and it will allow you to mitigate a lot of incoming melee damage for a short period of time. This is useful if you're in a group and you're healing and you get some mobs attacking you, or if you're soloing and you need a little bit of time to cast a snare or a root. Next, is Lion's Strength. This is added in Omens of War, and this spell is a bit of a one-of-a-kind. It will increase the melee damage of your target by 5%. I do not believe this is self-only, although I am going to go to Alakazam now because I'm curious. Nope, single target. So, I actually don't know much about this Lion's Strength spell. I believe it might have stacking issues with some other buffs, which is why I don't know about it. But that might happen later, so it might be very useful for this era and worth using all the time. And even if it does have stacking issues for some spells, which is possible, I believe that in group content, it will still be very valuable because you don't always have all of the classes around in a group that can cast buffs. So that's something to keep in mind. To me, this stands out, and it's probably going to be a very good spell to use in Omens of War. I just don't remember Druids using it in Reign of Fear and beyond. So, Aura of Life. This is the aura that is added in Row for your class. Almost every class gets an aura in Prophecy of Row, and yours kind of sucks. It's probably going to be worth using until you get a better one. However, eventually in House of Thule, you're going to get something called Wildfire Aura, which is the best aura for your class and the aura that you'll be using from then on. It is it's the main aura that is going to give you the most ADPS for your class, and after Druids get Wildfire Aura, you're basically delegated to the caster DPS group in raids. And you're going to be healing the caster ADPS group. That will be your job, and you will be providing stuff like Wildfire Aura and Group of the Black Wolf for support. Again, that will only start in like House of Thule and beyond, but I have a lot of experience raiding on a Druid in Reign of Fear, Call of the Forsaken, and the Darkened Sea. So I know that's my raid rotation. So skills. Druids come with 2 skills that are really worth using, which is Tracking and Forage. I have a little bit of information here about Forage. Forage is useful later on in expansions. It will allow you to forage trade skill materials that you would normally only be able to get for drops. And Tracking is useful if you're looking for mobs that, have different spawn locations or they patrol around. It will help you find mobs easier. I find a lot of solo players use Tracking more than boxers. It's a little bit of a pain in the ass to track mobs if you're boxing, but it is a useful skill that Druids, Rangers, and a few other classes get. So now looking at AAs. I'm only going to talk about clicky AAs because, well, there's so many passive AAs, it would make this a 2-hour video to cover all of them. So let's start with Luckland. Now I'm also going to tab into EQ for this part of the video because I want to read off the spells as we get them in Luckland. Or I should say as we get them throughout the game. So you can see Dire Charm here. Dire Charm is what allows you to permanently charm a monster, and it is okay during Luckland Plains of Power, but it starts to get really shitty after that. Mass Group Buff. This will allow you to turn any group buff that you're casting into basically an AoE buff. Very good for damage shield, regen, or whatever it is that you're casting. You can turn it into an entire raid-wide buff, save you a little bit of time. Exodus. Basically what Exodus does is it allows you to sucker with just a button click instead of having to memorize a spell. So it frees up a spell slot. Innate Camouflage, same deal. You can camouflage with an AA instead of memorizing a spell. Basically just a time saver. So looking at Plains of Power, Wrath of the Wild is added, which is a short cooldown, very shitty AA that basically no Druids use. I personally didn't really use it that much. I have Wrath of the Wild cast during one of my buff macros for a Druid, and then I don't really use it outside of that. So whenever I buff with like damage shield or something like that, I'll cast Wrath of the Wild on the tank and basically call it a day. It just adds a little tiny, teeny weeny bit of DPS for a short amount of time because it only lasts for 5 hits and then it's gone. Spirit of the Wood. This is one of your main cooldowns that you're going to be popping on difficult fights or boss fights, and it stays that way basically forever. So in other words, read what it does, understand it, and why you're going to be using it. Hard fights, boss fights, it's great to pop. If you're not in an area where you're having a lot of difficult fights and you're not fighting any bosses, pop this whenever you pull a bunch of mobs then, because it's only a 15-minute cooldown, which means it's useful to pop from time to time. You're also going to be getting Radiant Cure and Entrap in Planes of Power. So Radiant Cure will cure your entire group of disease, poison, or curse debuffs. It's useful. You're going to be using it, especially when you have annoying fights like the monsters in Tower that put those debuffs on you. Entrap, it basically gives you a snare that you don't have to memorize. So it frees up a spell gem, much like Camouflage and the other one before it. So we'll skip to Omens of War, and then we'll go back to, actually Depths of Dark Hollow is after Omens. So Omens adds Call of the Wild and Secondary Recall. Call of the Wild is useless. Just straight up. Basically, what Call of the Wild does is it calls somebody back to their corpse, and it puts restrictive debuffs on them, right here with Revival Sickness. And in my opinion, what I think this was meant for is they assumed that people would be like, ew, 90% res, I don't want that. Just call me for the time being and I'll get a res later. That, I think, is what this AA was originally meant for, but in my experience, people are just like, fuck it, I'll eat the 90%. I don't feel like looking for a res later. And that's just how the cookie crumbled. I've never found a situation where I use Call of the Wild, really. Secondary Recall. Well, actually, the only time that I have used Call of the Wild is, I believe it is a res that, it's the only res that you get that you can use during combat. Even though it adds Revival Sickness and the person is called back to their corpse with no buffs, etc., it can still be used during combat, and I think that's the only time that I've ever used it. I don't even play with it on my bars anymore, at like when I get to level 100 plus. It's not worth it. So the next one is Secondary Recall. So during this era of the game, Secondary Recall sucks, just to be honest. Eventually, you will get a AA that allows you to take your entire group to your Secondary Recall bind location, and I think you get a spell for that too. And also they remove, eventually you can get enough level up ranks of this where they remove the requirement for the, it requires something to either, it requires a Stone of Marking in order to set your bind point. And that's eventually removed, and a lot of the penalties are eventually removed from it to make it actually useful. And that's when it actually becomes useful. So don't worry about it too much until then. So Dragons of Norath doesn't add anything as far as clicky AAs go. Depths of Dark Hollow, this adds a few. So Depths of Dark Hollow adds Silent Casting, also Shared Camouflage. So Silent Casting is going to be your first major burn clicky AA. And what I mean by that is eventually you're going to have a whole bunch of AAs and disciplines, etc. that you're a druid, you won't have disciplines. But you're going to have AAs that you pop during your burn rotation. Silent Casting is really one of the first ones that you pop. Because with all of your other burns, twin cast, etc., you're going to be doing a shit ton of damage, and you don't want the hatred from all of the damage you're going to be doing. And basically, druids will do decent damage eventually once you get all of your burns. Once you get twin cast and all of the other things that buff your damage, you'll do okay damage during your burns. Outside of your burns, you'll mostly be focusing on healing. Shared Camouflage. So this is basically a group version of your camouflage. It just once you get Shared Camouflage, you never use the other camouflage again, in my opinion. So during Depths of Dark Hollow, you're also going to get Convergence of Spirits and Nature's Guardian. So Convergence of Spirits is a single target version of the Spirit of the Wood spell, and you'll usually use these two spells at different times. Because if I'm not mistaken, they have stacking issues. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe those two, you might be able to cast them together on the same target. However, you might not get the full bonus of both at the same time, which is what I believe happens. So you want to use both of them at different times. And last but not least, you're going to get Nature's Guardian, which is about as useless as that little bear pet that you get during Velius. It's not even worth using, to be honest, but it's one of those things that you'll just add to your Swarm Pet macro once you get later in the game, and then you can just cast that and your little nature spirits at the same time, and woohoo, that's like 500 DPS or something like that eventually. When everybody's doing like 120k burns, your pet will do like 500. So that's about how much it sucks. And let me check one last time. I will check Prophecy of Ro to see if anything is added, and no, it is not. And that is really all for AAs. So let's go back to how to play Druid Basics. So this is, as I say here, this is a difficult one for me to write because there's a lot going on for Druids, and how to play a Druid is going to highly depend on the situation that you're in. Some groups may want you to heal. Some groups may want you to do damage. And some groups may want you to support. They may already have a healer, and in that situation, you would focus more on buffing, debuffing, snaring, and basically support the group. Whatever they're weakest in, you would bring it up. So this is where being a good Druid comes into play, and this is also where I'm going to talk about the people busting my balls for Druids being a worthless class. So, a good Druid, when they enter a group, they're going to realize what is lacking and where they need to fill the role. Sometimes you'll be told before you even get to the group, somebody will message you, hey, can you heal in this zone? And you should have a good idea of your abilities and what you can and can't do to know if you can do that. Of course, whether or not you can heal in a zone is going to depend on the tank, too. Because you may join a group and not know that the tank's gear is completely terrible, and they're getting spiked, constantly from damage, and you're going to have a hard time healing that. Especially in Classic and Luckland, before you start getting better heals. Because especially in Luckland, your heal sucks so much that if the tank has too much incoming damage, you just can't out-heal it. Your heal won't be good enough. And that's something you'll need to learn and pay attention to if you're going to heal as a Druid. Also, some groups may ask you to DPS. They might be short DPS. That is usually the best situation for you because then you can really shine. And this will let me segue into, as a Druid, you're going to really want to shine and stand out amongst other Druids and other classes because that's how you're going to get invites back to groups. And that's how you're going to get invites to high-end groups. Now, the opinionated version of this that a lot of people are probably going to give me shit for is I have a lot of friends that I met through the years playing Everquest that would always bust my ass because I played a Druid, calling it a useless class. And like I said earlier at the start of this guide, I understand why they say that. I know they're joking, but I understand why they say that too. And that's because if you're somebody that's looking to do some difficult content, usually you're not going to invite a Druid. Because if you need DPS, you're going to get a class that can actually do DPS. If you need a healer, you're going to get a class that can actually heal. Like, even though a shaman heals just as good as you, at least a shaman can provide haste and slow. That will increase the melee DPS of your group, and that will decrease the damage output of the mob, which makes healing easier. Druids can't do that. Druids can only heal. And the only DPS increases they get are like damage shield, I guess. So you're really hurting in that department. As far as a healer and you also can't res too, which shamans can't until the same time as you, but you really have to prove yourself if you're going to get any group invites as a healer. And a lot of the times you won't want to heal some difficult content because if somebody dies, you're stuck waiting for them to run back. And that's not very fun either. So this is where it comes to doing damage as a Druid. So a Druid can deal as good of damage as a mage. And if you're a Druid and you want to get invites to high-end groups, you may want to show people that you can do that. You'll want to use your big nukes and you'll want to blow up mobs and show people that you can do damage and stand out, and people actually know, like, hey, I can see the damage the Druid is doing and it's pretty darn good. You want people to associate you with that. because that's how you're going to get into the best and the highest end groups. Now, of course, leveling up and in XP groups and for like guilds that don't really care about min-maxing, you're not going to hit that wall that I'm talking about. Look at all of these EQ TLPs. For example, I'll use one of the guilds that we all know plays on these TLPs. You usually have the Insomnia Guild or the Faceless Guild that play on these TLPs. Usually those are the two guilds that care the most about min-maxing the shit out of this game. And somebody in those guilds, when they're looking to form a group, if they have min-maxing in their mind, they're not going to take you, because they want somebody that can do your job better, either a healer or a DPS. Like I said, they're going to look for a class that can do either of those jobs better, with the exception being if you show that you're capable of doing one of those jobs at a level above average, they will invite you and they'll extend that hand to you. Of course, like I said, not all people will be this way, not all guilds will be this way, not even the two example guilds that I'm using. There will be people who don't care as much in those guilds about these sorts of things. However, this is a hurdle you will face as a druid, because some people will look at the world through that lens of min-maxing. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about soloing as a druid. So druids do something called quadding or kiting, which is essentially the same thing. Quadding is essentially like the plural of kiting. So quadding, I think that word originally came to the surface because it was like when people pull 4 or more mobs at a time. Now, like if you pull more than one mob, they'll just call it quadding, which is quadding. I would assume quad means 4. So at least 4 mobs that you're pulling, but alas, these words are archaic, and I actually don't see many people use quadding anymore, except for like on Project 99 or something like that. So kiting and EQ is something that you're going to be doing. It's going to be one of your main methods of soloing as a druid, and you're going to want to make sure you get your improved damage foci before doing it. A lot of kiting is going to be very subjective. If you've never done it before, it's going to take a little bit of getting used to and a little bit of learning to pull it off. So, for example, you're going to need to know if you're looking at a room of 4 mobs, the question you might have is, which of these mobs do I pull first? Usually, you'll cast Snare on the furthest mob first, because as he starts to run forward, he'll aggro the room. So he has a few moments as he's running forward where you can cast Snare on at least one other mob. And then you want the mob closest to you to aggro you last, which will give you the most time to cast Snare on him. And usually you can get Snare on most of the room before it gets to you. And then as you're running out, you'll want to stop and start casting dots on mobs. Once you get all of the mobs into an open area, you will want to kind of group them up, because you don't want, if your mobs are all running out of order and like one is way ahead of another and like they're just all scattered, you don't have much time to med, and you don't have much time to do anything really. So what you'll want to do is run around in circles around the mobs. Not a perfect circle. Sometimes you'll want to do an oblong circle to group them up, and sometimes you'll as you start grouping them up, you'll want to tighten the circle. And that will usually allow you to get them into a nice little cluster, which will help you keep them all in one spot and give you time to run around and med. Use your extended target window to cast on the mobs and to click on them. Don't try to click on them actually in-game, because that'll be a pain in the ass. And that's really all you need to know. There are a few different things you can do to help yourself as far as kiting goes. You can get the Woven Grass Bracelet, which is a bracelet from Sky Shrine, from turning in the TOV gear. That will give you Drones of Doom, which is a clicky, which is a mana-free clicky, which is pretty good, although it will have a 7.5 second cast time, which kind of sucks. But yeah, that is how you will solo, and there's usually always going to be a couple zones that you can solo in as time goes on. In Omens of War, the Causeway, Noble's Causeway, is one of the zones that you can solo in, basically the first zone of Omens. Once the Serpent Spine is added, you can solo with snaring in the steppes and Icefall Glacier above that, Also, there's another zone above that near Ashengate, which you can kite into. Basically, there's always places you can kite. The main thing you got to watch out for is mobs that summon. But Druids are one of the only wisdom casters that are capable of this. Necros are the second best kiting class, but Druids do a pretty good job of it too. And that's one of the benefits of playing a Druid is you'll be able to solo. But that's really all that there is for the Druid class. I've covered more or less the entirety of my class guide. If there are anything I got wrong, please let me know in the comment section below. If this video helped you out, please leave me a like because that helps me out. And aside from that, any updates or changes that I make to the guide will be in the written version only. If there's a big mistake that I made, I'll do a little sticky post on this YouTube video. But aside from that, I will catch you guys around in future EverQuest videos. Peace.